All right, so we're here with Tim Stubson, a Republican running for U.S. House of Representatives. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You bet. I'm Brian Martin. I'm managing editor here at the Wyoming Tribune Eagle.
I'm Sharon Fain with Black Hills Energy.
Bob Feck, Shine Animal Shelter.
Again, welcome, Tim. The first question is, what specific issues or concerns caused you to run for Congress this year?
You know, for me, it's been a little bit of an evolution. So I'm serving in the Wyoming House for the last 9 years. I've dealt with a lot of these federal issues, and particularly over the last 4 years as a co-chair of our Select Committee on Federal Natural Resource Management. About 5 years ago, I remember having a conversation with somebody. You know, they always wonder what you're running for next, and asking, "Oh, so are you trying to get to DC?" And I said, "Who would want to do that? Who would want to go into a system that's broken, where you don't really see solutions being created?" But really, over the last 5 years, as I've worked on these issues, and I think gained a greater appreciation on how significant they are to the state, how important they are to our future, and how really, you know, just a stroke of a pen out in our nation's capital can change the way we employ people here, we live on our lands. It just, to me, became very important that we have somebody in that seat that has a history of working on the issues in the state, that knows the people of the state. And so I thought, when Cynthia decided that she was not going to run again, that it was it made sense for me to throw my hat into the ring.
Tim, what qualifications do you bring to the table that will help you serve as a congressperson?
Well, you know, for me, a large part of it, I think, is just a lifetime in Wyoming, working on the issues that are important to the people. And so I grew up here. I've spent my entire life in the state, grew up in Casper and in Cody. And I've spent the last 20 years in Casper. I have a law practice where I represent primarily small businesses, but some large businesses too. But through that experience, I really have seen sort of a frontline view of how our economy interacts with the governmental structure, how you know, decisions the state makes impacts employment and the ability to employ. And so that piece, but the other part is my legislative record and my legislative career. 9 years now in the Wyoming legislature, working in really, I think if you look at my record, you'll see I've been in the center of most of the significant issues over those 9 years. And that to me is a huge help, because not only do I have my own perspective on what the problems are and what the solutions are, but you run into people from all walks of life, from all backgrounds, whether they agree with you or not, and you get to sort of absorb that input too. And to me, that's been key.
What do you believe is the biggest challenge facing the nation? And then once you identify that biggest challenge, name a couple of others.
Our nation as a whole, I think it's frankly a total distrust in the system, the political system that we have right now. And I see it everywhere I go around the state, just an incredible frustration with a government, a Congress in particular, that doesn't work and doesn't seem to serve the needs of the citizens of our country. And, you know, the solutions to those problems are tough, but you have to start at least by trying to rebuild that trust. And when you look at Congress and you look at how they spend their time and really how they do their business, you can see it's designed anymore to be more a political fundraising machine than anything else. And actually dealing with issues, addressing problems becomes a secondary thing. And so that has to change. And I think until and unless we develop a little bit more trust between the people in our nation and the government of our nation, we're going to have a hard time moving forward on some of the key issues.
A couple other issues, concerns facing the country?
Well, the economy has to be a big concern too. I mean, particularly in Wyoming, we see it, but you still see it even in those areas of the country, more broadly speaking, a sort of malaise and a real continued effort to break out of economic crisis that now happened 7 years ago. And we have not been able to, as a country, really find our stride as an economy since that time. And there's still, you look at, for example, the Fed's policies on monetary policy, there's still a crisis. It's still a crisis monetary policy right now. So That I think is a huge issue going forward. But more. I've also talked to a lot of people, just the immigration issues, the fact that we've recognized. I'm trying to think now. George W. Bush, that was one of his first policy initiatives, and recognizing it was a broken system. Nothing happened, and here we are. Almost an entire presidency later in the same situation. So that's a key issue. Healthcare, and healthcare ties in pretty closely with the economy, but there's no shortage of issues out there.
Tim, one of the public's biggest complaints is about that broken system in Washington. How would you
Really, I've proposed a plan really to try to hold Washington more accountable, and which is only a first step, but I think it's an important first step. And it talks about making sure that Congress serves the people, not Congress. It talks about congressional pensions and doing away with those. It talks about congressional salaries and ensuring that people can't automatically increase those salaries. It talks about lobbyists and making sure they disclose where their money, what money they're bringing in, and who they represent when they're talking to your representatives. And it talks about what we do in Wyoming, have always done since the Constitution, which is one topic, one bill. So you don't end up burying, projects that could never stand on their own merits in the middle of some must-pass legislation. So that's a first step. More generally, in how to work. And you talked a little bit about across lines on issues to make sure we get things done. It's a process, and it's a process of building relationships. And again, I point to my record, and there are representatives in the Wyoming House that disagree with me on probably 90% of the issues, maybe not that many, but quite a bit. And yet we work together, and we've co-sponsored bills, and we've passed bills that help the state because we found where we can find those intersecting interests. And that's it. You have to make sure that you are speaking to others' interests, and because that's what they're there for. And we've done it through the state of Wyoming as part of the Energy States Producing Coalition. That's another example I point to, that we have the energy states, and we've worked together on energy policy, but we've gone beyond that. We've looked sort of at some unusual places, but been able to explain to and persuade some people that energy prices and increased energy prices impacts us all and impacts our economy across the nation. And so we've brought in people from North Carolina and the West Coast and places you never would have thought of who are part of our coalition now to help on energy issues. That's the kind of approach that you have to take in DC, is reaching to those interests and making sure that you've got compelling arguments about why they should be involved in your solutions.
Tim, you mentioned the one topic, one bill, which I think is one of the strengths of the Wyoming legislature. There really is no backroom deals. Mm-hmm. But do you think that you can convince at least more than half of Congress to make that change? Because I do think the general perception is there's nothing but backroom deals there.
Yeah. It's not an easy thing. And I wouldn't tell you I'm going to walk in the door and change that, but from day one. But you've seen progress on some of those types of issues move forward. For example, earmarking. There was a concerted effort against earmarking in the Congress, and they did something about it. And so that is a similar type of issue. So you're right. The difficulty is people take advantage of being able to bury junk in a bill, and that's how they get things done for their constituents that would never happen otherwise. And so part of it has to be a public outcry and a public upswell for that sort of approach. But the one thing Wyoming has to do is they've got to make sure that their guy is pointed in the right direction and that he's on board with that solution. And I think that ultimately you can get something done because, like I said, with earmarking, some of those things, we've seen it in the past.
Thank you.
Tim, you mentioned the fundraising problem and the fact that Congress seems to spend more time fundraising than passing legislation. How would you buck that system or prevent yourself from being caught up in that?
Quite frankly, if I win this primary, I've already done it because we have significant outside special interest money coming into this election from outside the state. And if I can win this primary, I've shown that I don't have to rely upon that I can come back, that really it's my friends, neighbors, colleagues in Wyoming, that's where we've been fundraising. That's how we've been getting what we need to run this campaign. And so frankly, if I win this election, I've already done that. You want to talk about a little bit more broadly and how that has to happen. Again, you have to start with your guy and make sure that he's focused on getting solutions to issues. The rest of it is going to, I think, be a process of moving away. Our campaign finance laws, it seems like every time we try to fix them, we tie the knot tighter and create more backdoors and create more difficulty in people just supporting their candidates, people running for election. Frankly, we need to simplify that, open the doors to transparency a little bit, because every time we do tie that knot, we push the funding back further, behind a few more curtains. And so pretty soon we're not going to have any idea who's supporting who.
How important is it for you to maintain your own voice and your own priorities if you're elected, rather than doing what the party leadership wants you to do or voting the way they want you to vote?
I'd change that question a little bit in that I don't plan on going there for my priorities. I plan on going there for the priorities of the people of Wyoming. And so that's key. I mean, I'm not going out there to climb any ladders, to reach any other positions. I'm going out there to represent the people of Wyoming. And I know that that's my sole reason for being there. And so for me, it'll frankly be a pretty easy decision to make. If my party's pushing me one way and I know the interests of my state are another, it's not that difficult of a decision.
Tim, we have a variety of issues we want to touch on, so we'll go down through that list, starting with military spending and protecting F.E. Warren Air Force Base. Where do you think the country's at in terms of level of military spending? Is it appropriate, underfunded, overfunded, and what would you do specifically about Warren?
The funding mix certainly isn't right. I mean, we have, I think, we could always you look at our military spending, and I think you say you could always use more to strengthen our defense, but I think more importantly, it's getting the spending where it needs to go. And we have, been very slow to transition from what's really been an old world military to a new world military that deals with the kinds of threats that we see today, where you have non-governmental entities posing some of the biggest challenges and security threats to our nation. So we've got to speed up that transition because we're spending a ton of money on weapon systems that make sense for wars that will never take place. And they always say that when you start a war, you start fighting like it's the last war, and you learn quickly that's not the way to do it. And I think we as a country are there a little bit. F.E. Warren fits in, making sure that we continue to have a relevant mission at F.E. Warren, and that mission is well funded is key. It's not only key as an economic driver to our state and to this region, but it's key to the defense of our country. And the nuclear threat is not going away. The nuclear threat, as we've seen with the North Korean missile tests recently, as we've seen in my consideration, an ill thought out Iran nuclear deal, continues to be an issue and will continue to be an issue. And so we've got to make sure that the weapon systems here continue to be first generation, that the mission, that if there's opportunities to expand the relevant mission, that we jump on those opportunities. And I've been really impressed as I've talked to the people in Cheyenne about how knowledgeable they are about the operations out there and about considerations moving forward on the mission out there. And I'd certainly work hand in hand with the folks here and colleagues in DC to make sure that good decisions are made in that regard.
Tim, the next issue is climate change and environmental threats, and link that to EPA and some of the accusations of overreach.
We've only got an hour, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But what are your positions on man-made climate change, environmental threats, and then the EPA's overreach in some examples in Wyoming?
Talk about climate change initially, I guess. I'm not one of those guys that says, oh, there can't be any possible way that carbon plays any role in how climate changes. We know climate changes. We know it always has changed and it always will. We know that carbon plays some role in how our weather systems work, but we don't. People do not really understand the interaction, especially of anthropogenic CO2 and how the climate works. And yet we're making decisions that promise and really assure significant economic harm to the people of our country and really the people of the world based upon those assumptions. And really, it's because we have an agenda driving that, and it's the environmental agenda and an agenda that would require us to really shut down significant amounts of economic activity that we have in our country and in other places in the world. And so I think the key example of that is coal and how the federal government has treated coal. And they have essentially said, this is a resource that even though it's available, even though it's inexpensive, we're going to just take off the table. And we have seen lip service given to investigating the ability to burn coal in a cleaner way. But you don't see realistic policy. You see the opposite happening when it comes to policies. And you see, for example, they have the renewable portfolio standards. They've been advocated at the national level, but they're in all sorts of states. That's nothing but picking winners and losers, because it doesn't say, hey, what that really says is you can burn coal as clean as you want. There could be zero CO2 emissions, but we're still not going to allow it. We're going to still require solar, wind, and what have you. And so we as a state, and I've been really proud of us as a state, being forward-looking, being proactive. We've invested tens of millions of dollars in clean coal technology. And we've done that. The university has made great gains in that research. I mean, being able to use CO2 really and utilize it to make building materials, for example. We know we can do great things in the lab, but moving it to a commercial level has been difficult because you have a federal government that says we're not going to even consider this resource. So how can you attract private investment to that? How can you actually get that done when you have a federal government that does that? And that's the key thing that has to change with regard to coal. It's just that approach that we're going to just take it off the table from the beginning. The state, through the integrated test center that we've been underwriting and pushing and funding. And I was in the middle of that legislation, trying to move this from the lab to commercialization. But if we had a federal government that even put just a little bit of money and a little bit of encouragement into finding ways to use coal in the modern world, we could change the game for coal overnight. And so that has to happen. The EPA more broadly, and we can talk about specific issues with the EPA, but they, on our committee, we have BLM folks come and talk to us, Forest Service folks come and talk to us. The EPA, who passes regulations that impact the state probably more than anybody else, has refused to come sit down and visit with us. We even submitted written questions to them. They refused to answer those, and really said, we don't deal with states like that, and that's fundamentally wrong, and really underlines the difficulty with working with an EPA that really thinks it's above the states, and that has to change going forward.
So your example of coal and on the EPA, if the presumed Democratic candidate is successful in the presidential nomination, do you feel that will change?
No. In fact, she said it won't. I mean, if anything, it'll, as I've seen the debates on the other side of the aisle, the presidential debates, it's sort of been one-upsmanship on what regulations are going to be putting on carbon fuels. And so I don't think it changes at all. And that's why you have to have a strong congressional position on it. And one that, at least if you can't get legislation through that instills a vision that says, yeah, we can use coal. Is it there to stop additional legislation that is going to take it further off the table as a resource?
Tim, what are your thoughts on Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, and what needs to happen with it? And then how would you ensure healthcare coverage for all people?
I'm a proponent of repealing Obamacare, and I think if you look at the stats for Wyoming, it's kind of clear why I am. You have a bill that was passed to make sure that additional people in the nation are covered, and yet you have in the state of Wyoming more people uninsured now than when the bill was passed. You have really, because there were no cost controls, there was no thought to really healthcare costs in that measure. You've got really an acceleration of the increase in costs in the state of Wyoming, and consequently the increase in premiums in the state of Wyoming. So there are, those principles of covering pre-existing conditions, that's important, and that needs to stay as part of the federal law. Those principles of being able to move your insurance with you when you move, that's an important principle, and I think one that people depend upon. So we need to make sure that that stays part of the federal law. But the other parts of Obamacare, and really especially in a state like ours where we've almost in many respects have a monopoly in the health insurance industry, it simply does not work, and it hurts people more than it helps them. And for Wyoming, and I've been talking about this out on the trail quite a bit, the single biggest change that would make the biggest, quickest impact for us would be allowing us to buy health insurance across state lines, national, and you have a federal program that says this is a health insurance policy that can be sold in all 50 states. If you did that, you would instantaneously lower the premium rates in the state of Wyoming because we have the highest healthcare costs, and you'd be able to spread out that risk not among 580,000 people, but among the population of our entire country. And so that's a big change. But it's a tricky wicket in healthcare. I think you fundamentally need to start moving towards including some economic considerations in healthcare decisions and making sure that people that both quality of care, cost of care becomes part of the overall picture. And unless you do that, you're going to continue. And as long as the federal government underwrites all healthcare, you're going to continue to have significant problems and really an unending spiral upward of healthcare costs.
Tim, I want to follow up. You mentioned that more people are uninsured now in Wyoming than when the ACA was passed. Where does that come from?
I think actually you can probably find those figures on the administration's own websites. They came out with a map of the country that showed the increase in insured populations around the country. And Wyoming was the single example of a state where there not only had there not been an increase, there was a decrease in the number covered.
I appreciate it. Talk to us about your plans or whether your priorities in terms of the federal debt and the federal deficit. How important is that, and what are your ideas for getting those two things under control?
I think it's very important, and it's actually not so important probably for us, but it's important for our kids and our grandkids. We pay or soon will reach the point where we're paying as much on the debt as we're paying on our GDP. By the end of the decade, we're going to reach a point where we're paying as much on interest on our debt as we pay for all of our defense costs in this national defense costs in this country. And so it becomes an issue not only just of economic security, but of national security. And so I've always been, in Wyoming, we've got a constitutional requirement that we balance the budget, and we do that. And in fact, I sat for 2 months working very hard and making really tough decisions to get that done at the beginning of the last legislative session. And I have been an advocate of a balanced budget amendment at the federal level because I think that's the only way you really get to the issue. I don't think Congress and the pressures on Congress that Congress has it in itself to be able to actually balance the budget. You saw back in the Clinton administration when we finally started not having deficits, you saw a spike in spending to match what revenue was coming in. And so, and that doesn't mean that you just flip a switch and tomorrow you start spending exactly what you're bringing in. There's economic considerations of stability, this is a big ship to turn around. So you may have to even set the framework out some years to get it done. But if you have that legal requirement, at least you start moving in the right direction. And, we make hard choices on priorities here in this state. We've cut programs we know people like that help people, but we've done it to balance the budget. Federal government doesn't do that. We need to make sure that they actually start weighing their decisions and making priorities. And the only way you do it, I think, is to have a balanced budget requirement in the Constitution.
Tim, can you talk to us about education reforms at the federal level, move away from No Child Left Behind and to the ESSA? And was that a good move? What more needs to be done?
Sure, it was a good move. As we in the state of Wyoming have worked on our own assessment programs and our own accountability programs over the last 4 or 5 years, we constantly ran into the handcuffs that the federal government had put on us through No Child Left Behind. And it was incredibly frustrating that you're trying to find out a system and work out a system that gives parents more information and that makes it more transparent in how schools are doing, how school districts are doing. And yet we were running into hurdles left and right through the National Department of Education. The federal government has too much involvement in education. In the Common Core issue that has been a great subject of discussion in this state, the real problem is that the efforts to use Common Core to take those decisions away from districts and parents and to put them in the hands of the federal government. And so there's some resources that might make sense to pass through the federal government, but by and large, we need to make sure that parents are making those decisions, local school boards are making those decisions. When you have a federal government and a nation of this size dictating what is going to happen in education, every mistake is magnified. And the beauty of local control is that you can experiment and you have the freedom to do that and find what works and what doesn't. And the more that the federal government is involved, the less that happens. So the move towards more state control that we saw in the ESSA was good. I didn't think it went far enough, but it was a good step in the right direction.
Talk to us, Tim, about endangered species and where you think things are going there. What reforms do you think are needed to Endangered Species Act, and then specifically some Wyoming issues?
Yeah, we really need to start over on the Endangered Species Act, really because of how it has evolved through litigation and through regulatory development. Look at the sage grouse in the state of Wyoming, and it wasn't the listing, that is really, it was the threat of a listing that totally changed how we do things in the state of Wyoming across our landscape. So the mere threat, and that's because if that bird was listed, it would have been an economic catastrophe for the state of Wyoming. And so you have a federal law that allows outside groups with well-funded groups to really hold the sword over our head economically on these things. And that's not how not what it was intended to do, not how it should work. So you've got to reach a point where we do species management in a way that at least doesn't hold the threat of economic destruction for an entire state, like for example, like the sage grouse in Wyoming. The other significant problem with the Endangered Species Act is just the total inability to get something delisted. Even when everybody agrees it's fully recovered, the impossibility of getting a species delisted in a timely way is a real headache. And we've seen that with the wolves in our state, with grizzly bear. But I advocate you listing a species for 10 years and then they have to come back and re-justify its continued listing, not the other way around. That's a simple change outside of the wholesale reconstruction of the ESA that I advocate, but a change that would make sense, that you move that presumption. And so then at least you've got some hope for getting those species that have been listed off, because when you have wolves that are running all around the state and yet we as a state can't manage them, that's a problem.
Tim, you're been living in Casper, where the airport's doing relatively well. It seems to be anyway. Employments are down in Cheyenne, and they are in some other places. How important is air service to Wyoming, and what's the federal government's role in that?
It's very, very important. I actually served on our airport board for 5 years before I joined the legislature. And so I got to sort of see up close those negotiations with big carriers and trying to get service in the state of Wyoming. And we'd go on these, we call them speed dating rounds. You go and you meet with the airlines and you sit down with them and try to convince them to come into your community. And you realize what a small cog we are in Wyoming in a very big machine. The real problem with federal interaction, they've been taking away the tools that we historically have had in this state for making sure that we had air service to rural areas. And I was up in Sheridan earlier this week and just talking about the work that they've had to do to get very, very basic service to their community. It shows you how important it is to have good, solid, consistent air service into some of the communities in our state. But the federal government, with their requirements, for example, pilot hours, one little change that they make, in their regulatory framework, it had profound impacts on small communities across the country in the availability of air service, because it limited the amount of planes and pilots that could fly planes into some of these markets. And so you have really a solution to a problem. There wasn't really a demonstrable problem with pilots not getting enough rest. I mean, there hadn't been the only accidents that had really been tied to that issue were international flights, not flights that originated here in the U.S. And so you have this solution that has no real relationship to any problem, and yet it ends up harming the state of Wyoming. And that's the kind of thing you see all the time coming out of the federal government on their rulemaking. And so if you could actually, if the FAA could step back and give a little more flexibility, especially to the small carriers, you'd see, I think, some real improvement in air service in the state of Wyoming. But the state needs to keep fighting that battle hard, but the federal government needs to give more flexibility so that rural areas can be served adequately with air service.
Tim, we're asking all the candidates for their feelings about the presidential candidates, the presumptive nominees from both parties, but especially the one from your party. What are your feelings?
Well, I've told a lot of people that Donald Trump wasn't my first choice, or my second, or probably my eighth, but but he is our nominee, and I'm going to vote for him and support him. And really for me, it's an easy decision. I look at the other side. I look at what Hillary Clinton has said. She wants to do both in the energy sector, but in the economy as a whole, and it makes it a very, very easy decision for me. That certainly doesn't mean I agree with Mr. Trump on all the issues, and I hope that he evolves as a candidate in a way that makes me like him more, frankly. But the hope I have is that having somebody from a different background, having somebody coming in that has been a builder, can prove to be a builder as the leader of our country. And so I have great hope, and we'll see how it plays out.
Tim, what do you believe are the priorities for Wyoming's lone member of the U.S. House, and how would you make sure your voice is heard among the 435 people?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and one I've talked about a lot as I've been out on the trail. I mean, priorities. It's of course you say Wyoming, but really it's how federal policy impacts the economy in the state of Wyoming. That's the first priority, and particularly with energy. And you talk about rolling back some of the regulatory overreach, which includes, you can go through a litany of 24 probably, but the regional haze rule, clean power plan. We had the fracking rule struck down, but we'll see. I think legislative action would still be appropriate there. Waters of the United States, all of this whole myriad of regulatory burdens that the administration has launched over the last 24 months or so. That's got to be a key priority, because I think you take those off, you take a lot of uncertainty off, and you spur investment in energy again. But you can do a lot more on energy too, including expanding markets. The federal government sits on LNG permits for months and months and months. If liquefied natural gas could be more easily exported, we would see an increase in our natural gas prices, and that would help the state of Wyoming. Coal ports is another one. But more broadly, beyond energy, in looking at the economy, I think small business is key to the state of Wyoming. We've always seen small business be the engine of economic development and job growth in this state. And part of it's our population, but part of it is because that's where you see innovation happen. And so we have a federal government that really requires you to have your own boatload of accountants and attorneys, even just to go into business. And so we've got to do, through our tax structure, through our regulatory structure, make it easier to do the business of business. And that's especially important for the state of Wyoming. So those are a couple of the key priorities. When you talk about reaching, how do you get action on those things? To me, it's really what I've been doing. It's building coalitions and relationships with those you work with in the House. And that's why I point so strongly at my track record, which is building coalitions of parties, a lot of them in some of these circumstances, which vehemently disagreed on an issue, but bringing them together and getting real solutions. And to do that, you have to speak to their interest, but you also have to have an incredible amount of integrity, because if people see cracks in your integrity, they're just not going to give you the time of day and not going to work with you. It means doing what you say you're going to do. All those things that we recognize in Wyoming are the way to get things done. I think they work out there too. You just have to do them. And it's ultimately sending somebody out there that knows it's ultimately about 218 votes. I mean, that's what your representative is there to do, is get 218 votes put together on an issue. And, I've counted votes on a lot of bills. I've been in legislative leadership the last 4 years, and you count noses, and that's invaluable experience on actually getting things done in DC, I think.
Any other questions? Tim, I want to give you an opportunity to address any other issues that we didn't address in our questions.
For me, as I look at our state, I'll just tell you, I feel I've got a stake in the future of our state. And that's because not only have I, been here my entire life, but I built my career here. I've raised my family here. I'm hoping we have the type of state that my 2 boys want to stay in, want to come back to. And so I really do. I mean, everything I have is because of the opportunities of this state. I mean, I went to the University of Wyoming, got a great affordable education in part because the state of Wyoming makes sure that we have available a great and affordable education. And so as I look forward and I look to this race and I look at who I would want in that seat, it's somebody that has a stake in the future of our state. And I have that. And I think what that means and what that translates to is really an unwavering focus on what's important to the people of the state of Wyoming. And when you've mentioned it a couple of times, you have 1 in 435 people. You've got to make sure that they're paying attention to what's important to the state of Wyoming. Because if that person is off paying more attention to what's on the front page of the Washington Post and what's on the front page of your paper, things get lost. If that person is looking at what their next stepping stone is, instead of what are the key issues of the state of Wyoming, those things get lost. And so that person asleep at the switch means it doesn't get done for the state of Wyoming. And I just, the great thing about Wyoming is your readers probably know somebody that knows me if they don't know me, themselves. And that's a great thing. That's a level of accountability we don't have many places in the country. But as I've been out talking to people on the campaign trail, I say, I make these promises. I say, I love this state. I say, I'm going to do these things, but talk to the people who know me and who have worked with me and have been in the trenches with me, as I've been working for the state of Wyoming, and they'll tell you. And I'm confident what they'll find out is that I'm true to my word and that my dedication to the state is real. And for me, that's key, obviously, in this election, but it's also kind of one of the better aspects of the state of Wyoming.
Anything else?
No, that's it.
Great. Thank you, Tim.
Yeah.
Appreciate you being here.
No, thank you again for having me. I appreciate it.